Eleanor Hayes believed that every tragedy in her life had begun in a blind spot, a moment unseen, a person unobserved, a truth hidden just beyond the edge of her vision. So she eliminated the darkness. Her estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, had 47 cameras, microphones embedded in walls that cost more than most houses, motion sensors that tracked every footstep across marble floors worn smooth by decades of wealth and 3 years of isolation. She was not afraid of thieves. She was afraid of people. The last time she trusted someone without evidence, she lost everything that mattered. So now her faith lived in data alone, in the cold certainty of recorded proof, in the knowledge that nothing could happen in her home without her witnessing it. Until the night a janitor walked through her door and never once looked up at the cameras watching him, and Eleanor discovered that some truths refused to be captured on any screen. His name was Marcus Webb, and he came through a staffing agency that specialized in discretion. 42 years old, a black single father, widower, father to a 10-year-old daughter named Zoe. His background check was clean. His references were unremarkable, and his interview had lasted exactly 7 minutes because he answered every question with the minimum number of words required. Eleanor had not conducted that interview. Her household manager had. But she watched the recording afterward, the way she watched everything, and what struck her was not what Marcus said, but what he did not do. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not ask about the estate or its owner. He did not make small talk or attempt to establish rapport. He simply stated his qualifications, confirmed his availability for the night shift, and waited in silence until he was dismissed. The agency had sent him to fill a gap in her staff. The previous night, Janitor had quit without notice, claiming the overnight hours were affecting his health. Eleanor suspected the real reason was the cameras. Some people could not tolerate being watched. Marcus Webb did not seem to notice them at all. But that assessment, Eleanor would later realize, was the first of many miscalculations she would make about the man who would dismantle everything she had built to keep herself safe. 3 months later, at 3:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, Eleanor sat in her security room staring at 6 monitors that showed a man standing motionless before a portrait of her dead mother. She had not slept in 3 days. Dark circles pooled beneath her eyes like bruises, and her hands trembled as she reached for the audio controls, turning the volume to maximum, desperate to hear what Marcus Webb whispered to a woman he had never met. The microphone caught only fragments. Breath, the faint rustle of his uniform, and then, barely audible, words that would haunt Eleanor for weeks to come. Marcus's voice carried through the speakers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his size, with the quiet intensity Eleanor had observed for 63 nights. He was speaking to Catherine Hayes, to the oil painting that hung in the East Wing hallway, to the rendered face of a woman who had died 3 years ago because someone had failed to pay attention. Eleanor's finger hovered over the rewind button. She had watched this footage 17 times in the past hour, trying to decode the mystery of why her night janitor, a man paid to clean floors, had developed what could only be described as a ritual. Every night, without fail, Marcus Webb diverted from his assigned route at precisely 3:45 in the morning. He walked to the East Wing hallway. He stopped before Catherine's portrait. And he spoke. The first time Eleanor noticed this pattern, she assumed theft. She reviewed footage of the hallway from every angle, searching for evidence that Marcus was casing the bronze sculpture that sat on a pedestal 3 feet from the portrait, a figure of a woman with arms raised toward the sky that her mother had commissioned a year before her death. But Marcus never touched the sculpture, never moved toward it. His attention remained fixed on Catherine's painted face with an intensity that suggested recognition, or perhaps remembrance. Eleanor leaned closer to the monitor now, watching Marcus's lips move in the grainy night vision feed. She had upgraded this camera 2 weeks ago, installing a model capable of capturing detail in near total darkness. But even the enhanced technology could not penetrate the mystery of what drove a janitor to commune with a dead woman's portrait at an hour when the rest of the world slept. The footage showed Marcus reaching out slowly, his dark fingers hovering inches from the gilded frame but never making contact. His hand trembled. Eleanor zoomed the camera, focusing on his face, and for the first time in 63 nights of observation, she saw Marcus Webb's careful composure crack. A single tear traced down his cheek, catching the infrared light and appearing white-hot on the monitor. Eleanor's phone rang. The sound shattered the silence of the security room, and she flinched, hand flying to her chest where her heart hammered against her ribs. The caller ID showed her therapist's name, Dr. Patricia Morrison, their standing 4 a.m. appointment scheduled during the hours when Eleanor's insomnia peaked and her grip on rational thought loosened. She answered without taking her eyes from the monitor. Patricia's voice filled the room, professional concern wrapped in practiced calm. "Eleanor, have you slept?" "No." "Are you watching the cameras again?" The question required no answer. Patricia knew. She always knew. 3 years of twice-weekly sessions had given the woman an uncomfortable ability to read Eleanor's silences. "We talked about this," Patricia continued when Eleanor offered nothing. "Surveillance isn't safety. It's a cage you've built around yourself, and every day you spend watching those monitors is another day you're not living your life." "But what if this time," Eleanor heard herself say, voice rough from disuse, "what if this time the cameras showed me something true?" The question hung in the air between them, carried over cellular towers and fiber optic cables, traveling from Eleanor's fortress to Patricia's home office, where the therapist likely sat in her leather chair, notepad balanced on her knee, already calculating how to guide her most difficult patient back from the edge of obsession. "Tell me what you saw." So Eleanor did. She described Marcus Webb in halting sentences, explaining how he had appeared 8 weeks ago as just another employee, another person to monitor and catalog and assess for potential threats. She outlined his patterns, the meticulous way he cleaned, the precision of his movements, the fact that he brought his own food and never used the break room when other staff were present. She detailed the pipe burst incident from 7 weeks prior, when Marcus had worked 47 minutes in negative 12-degree weather to prevent catastrophic damage to the estate's foundation. Never calling for help, never seeking credit, just doing what needed to be done because the alternative was unacceptable. And then she described the portrait visits. 63 nights. 63 conversations with Catherine Hayes. Patricia was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, something Eleanor recognized as clinical interest wrestling with therapeutic caution. "Have you considered simply asking him why?" Eleanor laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in her throat. "And admit I've been watching him, that I've documented his every movement for 2 months, that I know things about him he never consented to share." "Eleanor, he works in your home. He knows about the cameras. It's in his employment contract. He knows about security cameras for safety. He doesn't know about the 47 cameras, the hidden microphones, the fact that I watch him 6 hours a day." Silence again. Eleanor could picture Patricia's face, the slight tightening around her eyes that appeared whenever Eleanor revealed the true extent of her surveillance operation. The therapist had tried for 3 years to help Eleanor dismantle what she had built, to guide her back to some version of normalcy where trust was possible and other humans were not automatically suspect. But Patricia did not understand. She had not watched her mother die because someone failed to speak up. She had not spent 2 years in litigation, proving that negligence and silence had killed Catherine Hayes. She had not looked at the hospital records and seen, in black and white, that a nurse had flagged concerning symptoms and an attending physician had dismissed them, too busy or too arrogant or too certain of his own expertise to listen. Eleanor had learned, in the crystalline clarity that followed her mother's death, that the only person she could trust to pay attention was herself. And paying attention required constant vigilance. required cameras and microphones and motion sensors, required knowing. But Marcus Webb had introduced a variable she had not accounted for. He was not stealing, was not slacking, was not doing any of the things Eleanor monitored her staff to prevent. Instead, he was talking to her dead mother, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in 3 years, curious rather than suspicious. The distinction terrified her. Patricia's voice pulled her back to the present. "Eleanor, I want you to do something for me. I want you to turn off the monitors. Right now. And I want you to go to bed." "I can't." "You can. You choose not to. There's a difference between can't and won't. Not from where I'm sitting." Eleanor's gaze returned to the monitor, but Marcus was gone. The hallway stood empty, Catherine's portrait hanging in solitude, the bronze sculpture casting long shadows under the emergency lighting that stayed active through the night. Eleanor checked the timestamp. 3:52 a.m. Marcus's visits averaged 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He would be returning to his assigned areas now, resuming the methodical cleaning that would occupy him until 7 a.m. When his shift ended and he disappeared into his 12-year-old Honda Civic with the dent in the rear fender. Eleanor had reviewed footage of Marcus sitting in that car at the end of his shifts. He always paused before starting the engine, head bowed, hands resting on the steering wheel. Sometimes his lips moved, sometimes he just sat in silence, the weight of something invisible pressing down on his shoulders. Then he would drive away, and Eleanor would lose track of him until 11 p.m., when he returned to begin the cycle again. She had researched him, of course. Background checks were standard for all employees, but Eleanor had gone deeper. She knew Marcus lived in Hartford, in a 2-bedroom apartment that cost $950 a month. She knew he had $47,000 in outstanding medical debt, that his bank account currently held $89, that his daughter Zoe attended Riverside Elementary and participated in the after-school program until 9 p.m. on nights when Marcus worked. She knew he had been an accountant once, before his wife Emma died 4 years ago, before grief and financial ruin had forced him into whatever work he could find to keep a roof over his daughter's head. What Eleanor did not know was why Marcus Webb had chosen to work in her home. The staffing agency had 6 other placements available when Marcus applied. 2 paid more. 3 had better hours, but Marcus had specifically requested the overnight position at Eleanor's estate, and the agency, happy to fill a difficult slot, had not questioned his preference. Eleanor wanted to believe it was coincidence, random chance, the chaos of a universe that operated without plan or purpose. But 3 years of surveillance had taught her that people always had reasons, even when they hid those reasons beneath layers of misdirection and careful lies. Marcus Webb was hiding something. Not theft, not malice, something else entirely, something that drew him to Catherine's portrait night after night, something that made him cry in the darkness when he thought no one was watching. Patricia was still talking, her voice a steady stream of therapeutic intervention that Eleanor had stopped hearing minutes ago. She interrupted without apology. "I have to go." "Eleanor, wait." She ended the call and immediately pulled up a different camera feed. This one showed the main foyer, where Marcus was running his industrial mop across marble floors that already gleamed. His technique was flawless. Long, even strokes. No wasted motion. The kind of work that spoke to pride and discipline. Qualities Eleanor had noted in her employee files with the detached precision of an entomologist documenting insect behavior. But now, watching Marcus work, Eleanor found herself wondering about the man behind the motion. What did he think about during these long nights? Did he resent the work, the way his accounting degree gathered dust while he cleaned floors? Did he think about his wife, dead at 34 from lung cancer that had ravaged her body in the span of 4 brutal months? Did he worry about Zoe, growing up without a mother, watching her father work 2 jobs to service debt that should never have existed? Eleanor knew the answer to that last question. Of course Marcus worried about Zoe. Worrying about children was what decent parents did, and nothing in Eleanor's 2 months of observation suggested Marcus Webb was anything but decent, which made the mystery of his presence here even more confounding. She switched cameras again, this time to the break room where Marcus took his 30-minute meal break at 2:30 a.m. every night. He was not there yet, would not arrive for another hour, but Eleanor found herself studying the empty space anyway. The break room was one of 17 locations in the house where Eleanor had installed hidden microphones, small devices embedded in the coffee machine, the refrigerator, the light fixtures overhead. She told herself this was necessary. Employees gossiped in break rooms. They made plans. They said things when they thought they were unobserved that revealed their true nature, their real intentions. Rosa Martinez, the housekeeper who had worked for Eleanor for 18 years, had once told another employee that she felt watched constantly, that the cameras made her skin crawl, that she stayed only because she had a family to support and jobs like this were hard to find at 62. Eleanor had heard every word through the break room microphone. She had noted Rosa's complaint in the employee file. She had increased monitoring of Rosa's movements for 3 weeks afterward, searching for signs of disloyalty or theft or any behavior that might justify termination. She had found nothing. Rosa was exactly what she appeared to be. A tired woman doing her job, enduring surveillance because the alternative was unemployment. The realization had not prompted Eleanor to remove the microphones. Instead, she had simply filed the information away and continued watching, because knowing what people really thought was the only way to stay safe. Now, staring at the empty break room, Eleanor wondered what Rosa would think if she knew Eleanor was having a crisis of conscience over Marcus Webb. Would she laugh? Feel vindicated? Or would she recognize the tragedy of a woman so afraid of being surprised that she had turned her own home into a panopticon, with herself as both prisoner and guard? The question lodged in Eleanor's throat like a stone. She turned away from the monitors, but their glow followed her, 6 screens casting cold light across the walls of the security room. This room had once been a library. Catherine Hayes had filled it with first editions and leather chairs, had spent hours here reading poetry and philosophy, lost in worlds that existed only on pages. When Catherine died, Eleanor had gutted the space. Out went the books, the chairs, the warmth. In came the monitors, the recording equipment, the server racks that hummed with the constant work of processing 47 camera feeds. Patricia would say this was pathological, that Eleanor had taken her mother's reading room, her sanctuary, and transformed it into the physical manifestation of trauma. But Patricia had not been in the hospital room when Catherine died, had not held her mother's hand as machines beeped and alarms sounded and nurses rushed in too late, had not learned in the investigation that followed that someone had noticed something wrong and said nothing, had chosen silence over advocacy, had let procedure and hierarchy matter more than a patient's life. Eleanor would never be that person, would never choose silence, would never miss a detail that might matter. She would watch and document and know, and if that made her pathological, then pathology was preferable to the alternative. The monitors showed Marcus moving through the house with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that work was meditation, that the repetition of simple tasks could quiet the chaos of a complicated mind. Eleanor had seen this quality in other employees over the years, but none had embodied it quite like Marcus. He approached cleaning the way a master craftsman approached their art, with total presence and complete attention. Every surface received the same care, whether it was the marble foyer or the utility closet near the garage. Every task deserved his full focus, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Except someone was always watching. Eleanor was always watching. And in 2 months of constant surveillance, she had learned more about Marcus Webb than he would ever willingly share. She knew he checked his watch at exactly 3:15 a.m. every night, that his pace increased measurably after that moment, that he worked with an urgency that suggested something important waited for him after his shift ended. She knew he avoided the staff break room when other employees were present, preferring solitude to the forced camaraderie of workplace relationships. She knew he never spoke unless spoken to first, and even then his responses were brief and courteous and entirely unrevealing. She knew that every single night, without exception, he found his way to the East Wing corridor and stood before Catherine Hayes's portrait, speaking words that Eleanor's 47 cameras and 19 microphones could not quite capture. A new thought occurred to Eleanor, sharp and uncomfortable. What if Marcus knew about the surveillance? Not just the visible cameras, but all of it. The hidden microphones, the motion sensors, the fact that Eleanor watched him for hours each day. What if his carefully controlled behavior was not natural discipline, but performance? A man who understood he was always on stage and had chosen his role accordingly. The possibility sent ice through Eleanor's veins. If Marcus knew, then everything she had observed was suspect. The pipe burst could have been theater. The portrait visits could be manipulation. The entire 2 months could be an elaborate con, with Marcus playing the role of the perfect employee while waiting for Eleanor to lower her guard. But that theory collapsed under the weight of its own paranoia. Marcus had not asked for anything, had not attempted to ingratiate himself, had done nothing to suggest he wanted anything from Eleanor beyond his paycheck. And the tears she had witnessed on the monitor tonight, those had been real. Eleanor had watched enough surveillance footage to recognize genuine emotion when she saw it. No, Marcus Webb was not performing. He was simply being, and that authenticity was precisely what unnerved Eleanor. In a world where everyone wore masks, where people said one thing and meant another, where trust was a vulnerability that predators exploited, Marcus existed without pretense. He was kind without seeking credit, competent without demanding recognition, present without requiring validation. Eleanor had spent 3 years building walls to keep people like Marcus out, and now she discovered that her walls were useless against someone who had no interest in scaling them. The night Marcus had saved the pipes, Eleanor had found him in the garage afterward, sitting on the concrete floor with his back against a wall, hands pressed to his face. She had stood in the doorway watching him, and for the first time since installing the cameras, she had felt ashamed. He had just worked 47 minutes in brutal cold. His hands were bleeding, his body shook with exhaustion, and Eleanor's first instinct had been to review the footage from multiple angles, to document what had happened, to catalog his actions for future reference. Patricia's voice echoed in her memory. Surveillance isn't safety, it's a cage. Eleanor had ignored the observation then. She ignored it now. Because if surveillance was a cage, then freedom was chaos, and Eleanor had experienced enough chaos to last several lifetimes. Better to be trapped in certainty than lost in trust. The monitors showed Marcus finishing the foyer, pushing his mop and bucket toward the service elevator that would take him to the 2nd floor. He would clean the upstairs hallways next, then the bathrooms, then the guest rooms that no guests ever used because Eleanor did not have guests, did not entertain, did not allow anyone into her fortress who was not paid to be there and contractually obligated to accept surveillance as a condition of employment. Eleanor's phone buzzed. A text from Rosa. Ms. Hayes, are you well? I left dinner in the kitchen but noticed you didn't eat, concerned. 18 years Rosa had worked here. 18 years of quiet competence and patient endurance. Eleanor knew Rosa's schedule as well as she knew her own. Knew Rosa arrived at 7 a.m. and left at 4 p.m. Knew she took lunch at noon and spent exactly 23 minutes eating while reading romance novels on her phone. Knew she called her daughter every day at 2:15 p.m., conversations that the break room microphone captured in fragments, grandchildren's achievements, worries about money, small joys in a life that revolved around caring for other people's homes. Eleanor had never thanked Rosa, had never acknowledged that she understood the sacrifice of 18 years spent under constant observation, had simply accepted Rosa's service as her due, the way she accepted that cameras recorded and microphones captured and servers stored every moment for future review. She typed back, "I'm fine. Thank you for your concern." Rosa's response came immediately. "Of course, Ms. Hayes. Please rest." Eleanor would not rest. Rest required peace, and peace required not knowing. And not knowing was the thing Eleanor feared most in all the world. The second-floor cameras showed Marcus emerging from the service elevator. He moved with the same steady purpose he brought to every task, but Eleanor noticed something different tonight. A hesitation. Marcus paused in the hallway, one hand on his mop handle, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Then he shook his head slightly and continued working, but the moment of uncertainty lingered in Eleanor's mind like smoke. What had he heard? What internal voice had given him pause? Eleanor cycled through audio feeds, searching for sounds that might have caught Marcus's attention, but the house was silent, except for the hum of climate control and the distant whisper of Marcus's mop against hardwood. She made a note in her surveillance log. 4:17 a.m. Subject paused work for approximately 8 seconds, appeared distracted or uncertain, resumed normal pattern. No external stimulus detected. The log was meticulous, 23 pages for Marcus Webb alone, covering 63 nights of observation. Eleanor had similar logs for every employee, though none were as detailed as Marcus's. He had become her primary focus in recent weeks, the puzzle she could not solve, the variable that refused to fit into her carefully constructed models of human behavior. Patricia would say this obsession was dangerous, that Eleanor was projecting onto Marcus all the things she wished she could trust about the world, that she was using him as a test case, a way to prove to herself that authentic goodness could exist, and if she found evidence to the contrary, she would have justification to maintain her isolation forever. Patricia might be right. Eleanor had stopped caring about Patricia's rightness weeks ago. The monitors showed Marcus finishing the second-floor hallways and moving toward the guest wing. His route would take him past Catherine's portrait in approximately 28 minutes, if he maintained his current pace. Eleanor settled deeper into her chair, preparing for the vigil she had maintained for 63 nights, the waiting that had become its own ritual. But tonight, something shifted. Tonight, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. She stood from her chair and walked out of the security room, leaving the monitors glowing behind her. Her bare feet moved silently across cool marble, down the main staircase, through hallways that felt cavernous without the mediating lens of surveillance cameras. The house was different when experienced directly rather than observed remotely. Larger, more empty. The silence had weight and texture, pressing against Eleanor's skin like a physical presence. She walked to the East Wing corridor and stood in shadow, 20 feet from Catherine's portrait, and waited for Marcus Webb to arrive. The minutes stretched. Eleanor's heart hammered. She felt exposed without her cameras, vulnerable in a way she had not experienced in 3 years. This was what normal people did, she realized. They encountered each other in physical space, without the buffer of screens and recorded evidence. They took risks. They trusted that the present moment would be enough. Eleanor hated it, wanted desperately to return to her monitors, to the safety of observation, but she forced herself to stay, to wait, to see what would happen when Marcus Webb discovered he was not alone. At 3:45 a.m., footsteps echoed in the hallway. Marcus appeared, pushing his mop bucket, his uniform slightly damp from work, exhaustion visible in the set of his shoulders. He stopped when he reached Catherine's portrait, setting aside his cleaning equipment with the careful precision Eleanor had come to recognize as his default mode. Then he looked up at Catherine's face, and his entire body seemed to soften. The careful control melted away. replaced by something raw and unguarded. Marcus raised one hand, fingers trembling, and though he did not touch the portrait, Eleanor understood he wanted to make contact with this woman he had never met, this stranger whose painted eyes seemed to hold some answer Marcus desperately needed. He spoke, and this time Eleanor heard every word. His voice was soft, barely louder than a whisper, but the hallway's acoustics carried it perfectly. The words landed like hammer blows, shattering every assumption Eleanor had built about why Marcus Webb stood before her mother's portrait night after night. "Mrs. Hayes, I never got to thank Sarah Williams for what she did for Emma. But your daughter's foundation honored her, and that means you must have taught her something about kindness, about staying with people when they're scared and alone. So I'm saying it to you instead. Thank you. Thank you for teaching Sarah how to care. Thank you for creating someone who made my wife's death bearable. Thank you for being the kind of person who understands that some things matter more than medicine." Marcus's voice broke. He pressed the heel of his palm to his eyes, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Eleanor stood frozen, understanding crashing over her in waves that left her breathless. Sarah Williams. The name was familiar. Eleanor searched her memory, pulling up images from foundation events, gala dinners, annual reports. Sarah Williams, nurse, board member, recipient of the Catherine Hayes Memorial Award for Compassionate Care 3 years ago. The woman who had held Catherine's hand in her final hours, who had stayed beyond her shift, who had made Eleanor's mother feel less afraid as the sepsis consumed her. Marcus's wife Emma had died at St. Mary's Hospital. Sarah Williams had worked at St. Mary's before transferring to Boston. The connection was clear, obvious in retrospect, but Eleanor had missed it entirely because she had been looking for threats instead of grief, for deception instead of gratitude. Marcus Webb had come to her home not to steal or spy or manipulate. He had come because he needed to be close to something connected to the woman who had shown his dying wife the same kindness Sarah had shown Catherine Hayes. He came here every night to stand before a portrait that reminded him of compassion given freely, of care extended beyond duty, of humans being good to each other in the darkness. Eleanor stepped forward. The movement drew Marcus's attention, and he spun toward her, eyes wide with something between shock and fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came, and Eleanor understood that he was weighing options. Apologize, explain, defend, flee. She saved him the choice. Her voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by emotion she had not expected to feel. "I know about Emma. No. I know about Sarah Williams. I know why you're here." Marcus's face went through several transformations in quick succession. Confusion, recognition, then something that looked almost like relief, as if carrying this secret had been its own burden, and he was grateful to finally set it down. "I should have asked permission," he said, and Eleanor heard in his careful words the expectation of termination, the understanding that what he had done was inappropriate by any measure, that coming here under false pretenses, even innocent ones, was grounds for dismissal. "No," Eleanor said, surprising herself. "You shouldn't have needed to ask. You should have been able to grieve wherever you needed to grieve." The words hung between them, confession and absolution mixed into something neither of them had anticipated. Marcus seemed to see her for the first time, not as his employer but as a person, someone who might understand loss, might recognize the desperate need to be near things that connected to people who were gone. "Your mother," Marcus said slowly. "Sarah told me once that Catherine Hayes was the kind of person who believed in kindness, even when the world forgot. When I saw the portrait, I thought maybe if I stood here, if I said thank you, maybe somehow it would reach the people who needed to hear it." Eleanor's throat closed. She nodded, unable to speak, because Marcus had just articulated something she had never found words for. The irrational hope that the dead could still hear us, that love persisted beyond death, that gratitude mattered even when its intended recipient was gone. They stood in silence, the absurdity of the moment not lost on either of them. Employer and employee. Billionaire and janitor. Two people who had both lost someone they loved, who had both built lives around the hole that loss had carved, who had both been looking for meaning in the spaces where meaning seemed least likely to exist. "I've been watching you," Eleanor said, and immediately wanted to take it back because the words were an admission, a revelation of her own breach of boundaries, her own inappropriate behavior. But Marcus just nodded. "I know. The cameras are hard to miss." "Not just the obvious ones, all of them. 47 cameras, hidden microphones. I've documented everything you've done for 2 months." She expected anger, disgust, violation. Instead, Marcus's expression shifted to something that might have been sadness, might have been pity. Why? The question was simple. The answer was not. Eleanor found herself telling Marcus things she had never told Patricia, never admitted to Rosa, never even fully acknowledged to herself. She explained about Catherine's death, about the nurse who noticed symptoms and the doctor who ignored them, about the lawsuit that proved negligence but could not restore life. She described the first camera, installed a week after Catherine's funeral, then the second, then the exponential growth of her surveillance operation, until her entire home was mapped and monitored and known. "I thought if I could see everything," Eleanor heard herself say, "then nothing bad would happen. I could prevent loss, stop tragedy, stay safe." "And did it work?" Marcus asked gently. Eleanor looked at him, really looked, and saw her reflection in his eyes. A woman who had become so afraid of being surprised that she had stopped living, who had chosen certainty over connection, who had built a fortress so complete that nothing could reach her, not danger, but also not joy. "No," she whispered. "It just made me alone." Marcus nodded as if he had known this already, as if loneliness was written across Eleanor's face in letters anyone could read if they chose to look. He glanced back at Catherine's portrait, then at Eleanor, and in that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with employment or observation, just recognition. Two people who had survived loss and built different prisons to contain their grief. His prison made of exhaustion and his daughter's needs and medical debt that could never fully be repaid. Eleanor's prison made of cameras and servers and the illusion of control. "I should finish my shift," Marcus said quietly, and Eleanor understood he was giving her an exit, a way to end this conversation before it went further, before either of them said things that could not be unsaid. But Eleanor had spent 3 years taking exits, avoiding difficult conversations, choosing surveillance over engagement. Something Patricia had said months ago came back to her. "At some point, Eleanor, you have to decide whether you want to be safe or whether you want to be alive." "My mother died at 3:15 in the morning," Eleanor said. "I've watched you check your watch every night at that time. When did Emma die?" Marcus's face showed Eleanor that she had guessed correctly before he spoke. 3:15 a.m., November 19th, 4 years ago. They stood in the hallway that was no longer just a hallway, but a shrine to shared loss, to the specific horror of watching someone you love slip away at an hour when the world is dark and cold and indifferent. Eleanor had never told anyone about checking her watch at 3:15 every morning, about the way that moment pulled her from sleep if she managed to sleep at all, about how her mother's final breath seemed to echo across years. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a very long time. "Me too," Marcus replied, and Eleanor understood he was apologizing not for Emma's death, but for Eleanor's loss. For Catherine Hayes, who had taught Sarah Williams how to care, for all the people who died at 3:15 in the morning, while those who loved them stood helpless, watching. The moment stretched. Somewhere in the house, a climate control system clicked on. Outside, an owl called into November darkness, and in the East Wing corridor of a mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, two people who had been strangers 63 nights ago stood together in the specific silence that exists only between those who have survived the unsurvivable. "You saved the pipes," Eleanor said finally, because she needed to say something that was not about death, something that acknowledged Marcus as someone who acted rather than just someone who endured. 3 weeks ago, when it was 12 below zero, you could have called emergency maintenance, but you didn't. Marcus shrugged. "Needed doing, and I've always believed," he paused, seeming to weigh his words, then continued, "some things you do right, even when no one knows." The phrase had weight, had been shaped by repetition, and Eleanor recognized it as something Marcus told himself, a personal credo. She filed it away, not in her surveillance logs, but in actual memory, the kind that mattered because it revealed character rather than behavior. "I know about your daughter," Eleanor said, then immediately regretted the admission because it revealed just how deeply she had invaded Marcus's privacy. But she pressed forward. "Zoe, 10 years old, after-school program until 9 p.m. on nights you work." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You looked into my family." "I look into everything. It's what I do." "Is it?" Marcus met her eyes without challenge, but without deference either. "Or is it what you hide behind?" The question should have angered Eleanor, should have prompted termination, should have sent her back to her monitors where she could watch from safety and never risk this kind of direct confrontation. But anger did not come. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to shame. "Both," she admitted. Marcus nodded, accepting this, and Eleanor realized he was not interested in judging her. He had his own survival to worry about, his own daughter to provide for, his own grief to carry. He did not have energy to spare on Eleanor's particular pathology. "I need to finish my shift," Marcus said again, and this time Eleanor heard the exhaustion in his voice, the bone-deep tired that came from working all night and then going home to be present for a 10-year-old who needed breakfast and conversation and the fiction that everything was okay. "Of course," Eleanor said, stepping aside. Marcus gathered his cleaning equipment and moved down the hallway, and Eleanor watched him go, this time with her own eyes rather than through a camera lens. The difference was subtle but significant. On monitors, Marcus was data, behavior to be cataloged and analyzed. In person, he was simply Marcus. Human. Complicated. Carrying burdens that 47 cameras could observe but never fully capture. Eleanor returned to her security room because returning was easier than remaining, because old habits had gravity and she had not yet learned how to escape their pull. But she did not turn on the monitors. For the first time in 3 years, she sat in the cold glow of sleeping screens and simply existed, thinking about Marcus Webb and Catherine Hayes and the specific loneliness of people who survive loss by turning their homes into prisons. Outside, dawn approached. Soon, Rosa would arrive for her shift, would begin her daily routine of cleaning and organizing and enduring Eleanor's surveillance with the patient resignation of someone who needed the paycheck more than she needed dignity. Soon, Marcus would leave, would drive his battered Honda Civic back to Hartford, would shower and change and transform from night janitor into father, present and attentive for the few hours he had with Zoe before exhaustion claimed him. And Eleanor would remain here, in her mansion with its 47 cameras, watching footage that showed her everything except what mattered. But something had shifted tonight. Some wall had developed a crack. Eleanor did not know if that crack would widen or seal over, did not know if she possessed the courage to dismantle what she had built. She knew only that Marcus Webb had done something unprecedented. He had made her consider the possibility that surveillance might not be the same as safety, that knowing might not be the same as understanding, that 3 years of watching had taught her less about the world than one conversation in a hallway. The revelation terrified her. But it also offered something Eleanor had not felt since Catherine's death, something fragile and dangerous and impossible to ignore. It offered hope that change might be possible, that prisons, even those built by their own inmates, could be escaped, that the first step toward freedom was simply recognizing the bars. Eleanor looked at the dark monitors and thought about Marcus checking his watch at 3:15, about the ritual they shared across different contexts, about how loss created its own calendar and time became marked by the moments when someone you loved stopped breathing. She thought about Catherine's portrait and Sarah Williams and the invisible threads that connected strangers through acts of kindness given years ago. She thought about Zoe, a girl she had never met, but whose existence she had documented in surveillance logs, a child growing up in her father's determined love, proof that life persisted even after loss tried to end it. Dawn light began to infiltrate the security room, painting monitors in shades of gray and gold. Somewhere in the house, Marcus Webb cleaned his final surfaces and prepared to leave, and Eleanor Hayes sat in the wreckage of her certainty, considering for the first time in 1,000 days the possibility that there might be another way to live. The cameras could wait, the monitoring could pause. For just this moment, Eleanor allowed herself to sit in unknowing, to trust that the house would not collapse and the world would not end simply because she stopped watching for one sunrise. It was a small thing, a beginning. But beginnings, Eleanor was slowly learning, were often small. Change arrived not in dramatic revelations but in accumulating choices, in the decision to turn off monitors or speak to employees as humans, or admit that 3 years of surveillance had protected nothing except her fear. Marcus Webb had not set out to teach her this. He had come here to say thank you to a dead woman's portrait, to stand in a hallway where kindness had once been taught and try to feel connected to something larger than his own grief. But in doing so, he had shown Eleanor a mirror, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked at her reflection without the mediating lens of a camera and saw what she had become. The seeing hurt, but it also clarified. And clarity, even painful clarity, was better than the fog of willful blindness Eleanor had been living in. She rose from her chair and left the security room, closing the door behind her. The house felt different in early morning light, less fortress and more structure, just walls and floors and spaces that could hold life if Eleanor allowed them to. She walked to the kitchen where Rosa had left dinner Eleanor had not eaten, and she stood at the window, watching the sun rise over Connecticut. Marcus's car appeared on the security feed she could not help but check one final time. He sat in the driver's seat with his head bowed, and Eleanor understood he was doing what she was doing, trying to find the strength to face another day, trying to honor the people they had lost by continuing to live. Then Marcus started the engine and drove away, and Eleanor was alone again with her cameras and her grief and the small, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to be. 3 days after their conversation in the hallway, Eleanor sat across from Marcus in the estate's formal library, a room she had not used for its intended purpose in 3 years. The leather chairs that once belonged to Catherine still held the faint scent of her mother's perfume, and Eleanor found herself gripping the armrests to steady hands that would not stop trembling. Marcus looked exhausted. The circles under his eyes had deepened since their last interaction, and Eleanor wondered if he had slept at all, if the exposure of his secret had cost him the few hours of rest he managed between shifts and fatherhood. He sat with the careful posture of someone accustomed to making himself small in spaces that belonged to other people. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation, had planned what she would say, how she would explain the decision she had reached in the 72 hours since standing in the East Wing corridor. But now, faced with Marcus's quiet patience, all her preparation dissolved into a single truth she had not intended to speak aloud. "I don't know how to be a person anymore," The admission fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples neither could control. Marcus did not respond immediately, just studied Eleanor with an attention that felt different from surveillance, more like witnessing. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the gentleness she had heard on the monitors but never experienced directly. "What happened to you?" Eleanor laughed, a bitter sound that caught in her throat. "You know what happened. You said it yourself. My mother died because someone didn't speak up, because negligence was easier than courage, because in hospitals like everywhere else, hierarchy matters more than humans. I know what happened to your mother. I'm asking what happened to you." The distinction was subtle but significant, and Eleanor found herself unprepared for its weight. What had happened to Catherine was tragedy. What had happened to Eleanor in the aftermath was choice. She had chosen surveillance over trust, chosen isolation over vulnerability, chosen the illusion of control over the messy reality of human connection. "I built a cage," Eleanor heard herself say, echoing Patricia's words from their 4 a.m. conversation. "I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just making sure nothing could reach me. Not danger, not joy, nothing." Marcus nodded slowly. "When Emma died, I quit my job. Told myself it was because I needed to take care of Zoe, because accounting required focus I didn't have. But really, I was running. From offices that reminded me of the person I used to be. From colleagues who wanted to talk about Emma like she was a story with an ending. From a version of myself that believed the world made sense. Did running help? No. It just changed the scenery." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Hayes, I don't know why you asked me here today, but if you're planning to fire me because I stood in your hallway talking to a portrait, I understand. I crossed lines. I'll go quietly." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not firing you. I'm asking if you'll help me dismantle the surveillance system." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to retrieve, and Eleanor watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, surprise, and finally, something that looked like concern. "Why would you do that?" "Because you were right. About the cage. About hiding. About everything." Eleanor's voice strengthened with each word, as if speaking the truth aloud gave it structure. "I've watched you for 2 months, documented your every movement, analyzed your behavior like you were data instead of human. And what did I learn? Nothing I couldn't have discovered by just asking. Nothing that justified the violation." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words carried careful weight. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate what you're saying, but I work nights cleaning floors. I'm not qualified to help you make decisions about security systems or surveillance or whatever mental health choices you need to make. I'm not asking you as an employee. I'm asking as someone who understands what it means to survive loss and build something to contain it. You have Zoe, your night shifts, the way you avoid people and keep everything controlled and neat. You have your own cage, Marcus. You just built it differently." The observation landed with visible impact. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Eleanor saw she had touched something raw, some parallel he had not fully acknowledged. But he did not deny it, and his silence was its own confirmation. "I'll think about it," he finally said. "But first I need to get home. Zoe has a field trip today, and I promised I'd see her off." Eleanor nodded, recognizing dismissal when she heard it. Marcus stood, and she walked him to the main entrance, an unnecessary courtesy that felt important nonetheless. As he reached the door, he paused. "Ms. Hayes, the cameras didn't make you safe, but taking them down won't either. Safety isn't something you can install or remove. It's something you have to risk." Then he was gone, and Eleanor was alone with his words and the weight of what she had set in motion. The conversation with Rosa happened 3 hours later in the break room, the same space where Eleanor had listened to 18 years of private conversations through hidden microphones. Rosa sat with her hands folded on the table, her face showing the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate surveillance by revealing nothing. Eleanor had spent an hour preparing for this, had pulled Rosa's employee file and reviewed every notation, every complaint she had documented in the past. The file was thick with Eleanor's observations, a catalog of 18 years reduced to metrics and behavioral notes. Reading it now, Eleanor felt something between shame and horror. This was how she had treated loyalty. This was how she had repaid years of quiet service. "Rosa, I owe you an apology." Rosa's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into neutrality. "For what, Ms. Hayes?" "For the cameras, the microphones, for treating you like a threat instead of a person for 18 years. Eleanor pushed Rosa's file across the table. "This is what I've been doing. Watching. Documenting. Analyzing. I've recorded private phone calls with your daughter. I know about your grandchildren's school troubles. I know you feel watched every moment you're in this house. And I kept watching anyway." Rosa looked down at the file but did not open it. Her hands remained folded, knuckles white with tension Eleanor had never noticed on monitors but could not miss in person. "I stayed because I needed the job," Rosa said quietly. "Because at 62, with my back problems and my accent, I'm not exactly employable elsewhere. But every day I worked here, I felt like I was being examined. Like one wrong move, one bad day, one moment of human weakness would end up in that file and cost me everything. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 18 years of dignity, Ms. Hayes. Sorry doesn't undo the feeling of being watched while I eat my lunch or call my daughter or just exist in the few spaces that should have been private." Rosa's voice remained level, but emotion leaked through the careful control. "You want to know what it's like? It's like being perpetually guilty of a crime you haven't committed. Like waiting for judgment you can never escape because the judge never sleeps." Eleanor absorbed the words, each one landing like a physical blow. This was what her surveillance had created, not safety, not prevention, just systematic dehumanization of people who depended on her for their livelihood and could not afford to object. "I'm taking down the cameras," Eleanor said. "Most of them. The hidden ones, the microphones. I'm keeping basic security for the perimeter, but the interior surveillance ends today." Rosa's hands unfolded. She looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes directly for what might have been the first time in years. "Why now?" "Because I met someone who showed me what I'd become. And because you deserve better than this. Than me." "Who? The new janitor?" Rosa's lips quirked slightly. "I saw how you watched him. Different from how you watched the rest of us. Like you were trying to solve him instead of just cataloging him." Eleanor had not realized her obsession with Marcus had been visible to others, but of course it had been. Rosa had survived 18 years by paying attention, by learning to read Eleanor's moods and patterns. The ability to predict was its own form of self-preservation. "Marcus made me see that surveillance doesn't prevent loss. It just creates a different kind of it." Eleanor took a breath. "I'm offering you a choice, Rosa. I'd like you to stay. I'll increase your salary by 25%. I'll provide a formal acknowledgement of your 18 years of service. And I'll never watch you again. But if you want to leave, I understand. I'll provide excellent references and a severance package." Rosa studied Eleanor for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself to sit with the discomfort of being seen rather than seeing, of being the subject of someone else's assessment rather than the one conducting analysis. "I'll stay," Rosa said finally, "but not for the money. I'll stay because I've invested 18 years here, and I want to see if you actually mean what you're saying. If you can actually change. And if you can't," she paused, If you can't, then at least I'll know I gave you the chance. The conditional acceptance stung worse than rejection would have, but Eleanor nodded. That's fair. More than fair. Rosa stood, smoothing her uniform with practiced efficiency. The tech company arrives tomorrow to remove equipment. I assume you'll want me to let them in? Yes, thank you. Ms. Hayes, one more thing. Rosa paused at the door. That janitor, Marcus, he's a good man. Don't hurt him by turning him into your redemption project. Whatever you're working through, work it through without making it his burden to carry. Then Rosa was gone, and Eleanor sat alone in the break room where she had listened to 18 years of private pain, feeling the weight of accumulated harm pressing down on her shoulders like physical force. The tech crew arrived the next morning with vans full of equipment and the cheerful efficiency of people being paid well to not ask questions. Eleanor watched from her security room as they began dismantling cameras, pulling down microphones, disconnecting servers. Each removed piece of equipment felt like losing a limb, and Eleanor had to grip the desk to keep from calling them off, from shouting that she had changed her mind, that she needed the surveillance even if it was destroying her. But she stayed silent, watched the dismantling, felt panic rise in her throat as camera feeds went dark one by one, as her view of the house narrowed and narrowed until only the 12 exterior cameras remained active, showing her nothing but perimeter and lawn and the outside world she had stopped inhabiting 3 years ago. Patricia called while the crew was still working, and Eleanor answered without checking the caller ID, desperate for any distraction from the anxiety consuming her. I heard from Rosa, Patricia said without preamble. She was worried about you. Said you were having the surveillance system removed and seemed like you might be falling apart. Eleanor laughed, a jagged sound. Rosa tattled on me to my therapist? Rosa cares about you, despite everything, and she's right to worry. Eleanor, this is a major change. You can't just rip out your coping mechanisms without having something to replace them. My coping mechanisms were hurting people. They were also keeping you functional, stable. Now you're removing them cold turkey, with no support system, no plan for how to manage the anxiety that's going to hit you like a freight train the moment those cameras go dark. Patricia's voice carried professional concern wrapped in personal frustration. This is the kind of decision you make in therapy, Eleanor, over months, with preparation and tools and— I don't have months, Eleanor interrupted. I've already done enough damage. 18 years of hurting Rosa, 2 months of treating Marcus like a specimen, 3 years of turning my home into a prison. How much more time should I take to prepare before I stop causing harm? Patricia sighed. Noble, but also potentially self-destructive. Promise me you'll call if you spiral. Promise me you won't just sit alone in that house letting panic consume you. I promise. Liar. But I had to try. Patricia paused. For what it's worth, Eleanor, I'm proud of you. This takes courage. Or desperation. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. After the call ended, Eleanor returned to watching the tech crew work. They were in the East Wing now, removing the camera that had captured Marcus's nightly vigils before Catherine's portrait. Eleanor thought about all the footage stored on servers, all the private moments preserved in digital amber. The crew would wipe the servers as part of their contract, would erase 2 months of Marcus and 18 years of Rosa and 3 years of Eleanor's desperate attempt to prevent surprise. Good, Eleanor thought. Let it be erased. Let the evidence of her pathology disappear. Some things deserved to be forgotten. By evening, the work was complete. The tech supervisor handed Eleanor a tablet showing the reduced system. 12 exterior cameras, 48-hour footage retention, no audio recording. Basic security, he explained. Industry standard for a property this size. Nothing invasive, nothing inappropriate. Eleanor signed off on the work and the man left, and she stood in her security room looking at monitors that showed her nothing but lawn and driveway and the perimeter of a world she no longer controlled. The panic hit 20 minutes later. It started as tightness in her chest, a constriction that made breathing difficult. Then her heart rate spiked, hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape. Her vision tunneled. The room tilted. She gripped the desk, trying to ground herself, trying to remember the breathing exercises Patricia had taught her, but nothing worked because this was not ordinary anxiety. This was the terror of having voluntarily blinded herself, of having removed the tools that had kept her functional for 3 years, of being suddenly, utterly vulnerable to a world she no longer understood how to navigate. Eleanor fumbled for her phone, but her hands shook too badly to dial. She slid to the floor, back against the wall, and felt panic consume her in waves that left her gasping and crying and convinced she was dying, that this was it, that removing the cameras had broken some essential part of her and she would not survive the night. Time became meaningless. Seconds or minutes or hours passed while Eleanor fought for air and tried to convince her body that it was not actually in danger, that panic could not kill, even though it felt like death. Eventually, the waves receded enough for her to crawl to her phone and call the one person who might understand. Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Ms. Hayes?" "I can't breathe," Eleanor gasped out. "The cameras are gone and I can't breathe and I'm sorry for calling, but I didn't know who else." "Where are you?" "Security room, 2nd floor." "Stay there. I'm coming." The line went dead. Eleanor tried to tell herself this was inappropriate, that she could not call her employee in the middle of the night because she was having a panic attack, that Marcus had his own life and his own daughter and his own problems. But she could not make herself hang up. Could not make herself do anything except sit on the floor and try to survive until help arrived. Marcus appeared 47 minutes later, still wearing sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, his hair uncombed and his face creased with concern. He crouched beside Eleanor, not touching, just present. "Breathe with me," he said quietly. "In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Eleanor tried, failed, tried again. Marcus kept counting, his voice steady and calm, and gradually Eleanor's breathing began to match his rhythm. The panic did not disappear, but it loosened its grip enough for her to think, to remember that she had survived panic attacks before, that this too would pass. They sat like that for perhaps 10 minutes, Marcus counting breaths while Eleanor fought to keep her lungs functioning. Finally, when the worst had passed, Marcus spoke again. "First panic attack since removing the cameras?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "There'll be more. Probably a lot more." Marcus shifted to sit against the wall beside her, careful to maintain distance. "When Emma died, I had panic attacks for 6 months. Couldn't be in hospitals. Couldn't hear sirens without my chest locking up. Couldn't see people coughing without being back in that room, watching her struggle for air. How did you stop them?" "I didn't. I learned to ride them out. Learned they couldn't actually kill me even though they felt like death." Marcus looked at the dark monitors. "You did something brave today. Something necessary. But brave and necessary doesn't mean easy or painless." Eleanor's laugh came out wet, choked. "I called my employee at 2 in the morning because I was having a panic attack about removing surveillance equipment. That's not brave. That's pathetic. It's human, which for you might actually be braver." Marcus rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. "Ms. Hayes, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Why did you really remove the cameras?" "I told you, because I realized they were hurting people." "That's part of it. But what's the other part? The part you're not saying?" Eleanor stared at the dead monitors, at the reflection of herself and Marcus visible in their dark screens. When she spoke, Her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I saw myself through your eyes, saw what I'd become, and I couldn't live with it anymore. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, that's real. But here's the thing you need to understand. You can't change for me. Can't change to earn my approval or prove you're a good person. You have to change for yourself, because you actually want to be different. Otherwise, the first time change gets hard, you'll slide back to what's comfortable. And if I can't, if I'm too broken to actually change, then you're human and you keep trying anyway. Marcus glanced at his watch. I need to get back. Zoe's with my neighbor, but I don't like leaving her overnight. Guilt crashed over Eleanor. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have called. You have your daughter and your life, and I had no right. Stop. Marcus's voice was firm, but not harsh. You needed help. You asked for it. That's good. That's progress. But next time, maybe call your therapist first. I'm your employee, Ms. Hayes. I want to help, but I can't be your emotional support system. That's not healthy for either of us. The words stung, but Eleanor recognized their wisdom. Rosa had said something similar. Don't make Marcus carry your burden. Don't turn him into your redemption project. The people who worked for her were not responsible for healing her trauma. You're right. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just get yourself some actual support. Marcus stood, offering Eleanor his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet with surprising strength. One more thing. Your mother's portrait. Would it be okay if I kept visiting? Even though you know now? Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had not realized she was carrying. Of course. It's not my permission to give or withhold. That hallway belongs to whoever needs it. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen from him in 2 months. Thank you. And Ms. Hayes, call your therapist. Tonight. Don't go back to being alone with this. He left, and Eleanor stood in the empty security room, surrounded by monitors that showed her nothing, and pulled out her phone. Patricia answered on the first ring as if she had been waiting. I had a panic attack, Eleanor said without preamble. A bad one. Marcus came and helped me breathe through it. Marcus? Your janitor? My employee who I turned into emergency support because I don't have actual friends or healthy coping mechanisms. Eleanor sank into her desk chair. Rosa was right. I can't make this his burden, but I don't know who else to call. You're my therapist, which means you're paid to care. Rosa is my employee, which means she can't tell me the truth without risking her job. I don't have anyone, Patricia. I removed the cameras and realized I've been alone for 3 years, and I don't know how to fix that. Patricia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness Eleanor had not heard before. Eleanor, I'm going to say something as a person, not as your therapist. You're not alone right now. You called me. You called Marcus. That's more connection than you've had in 3 years. It's messy and imperfect, and you probably crossed some boundaries, but you reached out. That matters. I don't know how to do this. How to be a person again. I know, and that's okay. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. You just have to survive tonight. Can you do that? Eleanor looked at the dark monitors, at the security room that had been her command center and her cell. Yes, I can survive tonight. Good. Then do that. Survive tonight. Tomorrow we'll work on surviving tomorrow. They talked for another hour, Patricia guiding Eleanor through breathing exercises and grounding techniques, building a plan for managing the anxiety that would inevitably return. When they finally hung up, Eleanor felt exhausted but functional, capable of making it through the remaining hours of darkness. She left the security room and walked through the house, experiencing it differently without the buffer of cameras. The silence felt heavier. The spaces felt larger. Every shadow could hide anything, and Eleanor had to actively fight the urge to check monitors, to verify that the house remained secure, but she did not check, did not return to the security room. Instead, she walked to the East Wing corridor and stood before Catherine's portrait, seeing her mother's painted face for the first time without simultaneously watching herself watch it on camera. "I'm trying, Mom," Eleanor whispered. "I don't know if I can do this. Don't know if I'm strong enough, but I'm trying." Catherine's painted eyes offered no answer, no reassurance, just the fixed expression of oil and canvas, preserved forever in a moment before death, before loss, before Eleanor learned that the world could steal people you loved and leave you drowning in the aftermath. Eleanor reached out and touched the frame, the first time she had made physical contact with the portrait since its installation 3 years ago. The wood was smooth and cool, solid in a way that felt grounding. Marcus touched this frame, stood in this spot, found some measure of peace in proximity to a woman who had taught someone else how to care. Perhaps Eleanor could find peace here too, not through surveillance, not through control, just through standing in a hallway at 3 in the morning, acknowledging loss, and choosing to keep living anyway. The days that followed tested Eleanor in ways she had not anticipated. Without cameras to occupy her attention, time expanded into endless hours that needed filling. She tried reading, but could not focus. Tried working on foundation business, but found herself constantly checking empty monitors, searching for threats that were not there. The anxiety was persistent and exhausting, a low-grade panic that spiked unpredictably and left her shaking. Rosa noticed. Brought meals Eleanor did not eat. Left notes reminding her to drink water, to rest, to breathe. The kindness was unexpected and almost unbearable, and Eleanor found herself crying at random moments, overwhelmed by the realization that Rosa had cared about her despite 18 years of surveillance, that humans could offer compassion even to those who had treated them poorly. Marcus continued his night shifts, and Eleanor forced herself not to watch his arrival or departure, not to track his movements through the house. She stayed away from the security room entirely, sleeping instead in her bedroom like a normal person, waking at irregular hours to panic and darkness and the slow understanding that healing would take longer than 3 days or 3 weeks or possibly 3 years. On the 4th day, Rosa appeared at Eleanor's study with mail and a determined expression that suggested bad news. "Ms. Hayes, there's something you need to know about Marcus." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Is he quitting?" "No, but his daughter had an incident at school yesterday." Rosa's voice was careful. "I overheard him on the phone with the principal. A teacher searched Zoe's belongings in front of the entire class, accused her of stealing because she had a science kit that seemed too expensive for—" Rosa paused delicately. "For what the teacher assumed Marcus could afford." Eleanor felt rage ignite in her chest, sharp and clean. The teacher racially profiled a 10-year-old child. That's what it sounds like. Marcus was very calm on the phone, but I could hear the anger underneath. The kind of anger that comes from a lifetime of this happening. Rosa set down the mail. "I thought you should know, because Marcus won't tell you. He keeps his work separate from his life. But after he helped you the other night, I figured maybe you could help him." Eleanor was already reaching for her phone, pulling up the contact information for Riverside Elementary that existed in the background check file she had compiled on Marcus. Rosa watched her with an expression that might have been approval. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make a phone call, and then I'm going to write a check." Eleanor's hands were steady for the first time in days, purpose overriding anxiety. "No child should be humiliated like that. Not in my name. Not when I have the resources to change it." She called the school, asked to speak with the principal, was put on hold. While she waited, Rosa brought her tea and sat in the chair across from Eleanor's desk, a quiet show of support that felt significant given their history. The principal finally picked up, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to managing difficult parents. "This is Principal Morrison. How can I help you?" Eleanor introduced herself, explained that she was calling regarding Zoe Webb, described what she understood had happened. The principal's tone shifted immediately when he recognized Eleanor's name, when he understood he was speaking with someone whose wealth gave her words weight. "Ms. Hayes, I assure you this was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Patterson was simply following protocol when she noticed a student with expensive equipment. She singled out a black child and searched her belongings in front of her peers. That's not protocol. That's racial profiling." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but steel threaded through every word. "I'm calling to inform you that I will be making a substantial donation to Riverside Elementary. $50,000, earmarked specifically for diversity training and anti-bias education for all staff members. I will also be requesting a formal apology to Zoe Webb and her father and a review of Mrs. Patterson's conduct." Silence on the other end. Then the principal's voice, now obsequious. "That's very generous, Ms. Hayes. We would be honored to accept such a donation. I'll personally ensure that Zoe receives an apology and that we review our procedures." "You'll do more than review. You'll change them. Because if I hear of another incident like this, I'll pull the donation and make sure every parent in your district knows why." Eleanor paused. "Do we understand each other?" "Yes, Ms. Hayes. Absolutely." She ended the call and looked at Rosa, who was smiling for the first time in Eleanor's recent memory. That felt good, didn't it? "It did," Eleanor admitted. "But now I need to figure out how to tell Marcus without making him feel like I'm overstepping, or like I'm trying to buy my way into his good graces. Tell him the truth, that you heard what happened, that it was wrong, that you used your resources to address it." Rosa stood. "Marcus isn't proud in the toxic way. He'll accept help if it's offered honestly." Eleanor hoped Rosa was right. Hoped Marcus would understand that this was not charity or interference, just one person using privilege to protect a child who deserved protection. Marcus arrived for his shift that evening, and Eleanor was waiting in the foyer, having abandoned all pretense of not tracking his schedule. He stopped when he saw her, wary. "Ms. Hayes, is something wrong?" "I heard about Zoe, about what happened at school." Eleanor watched his expression close, walls slamming up with visible speed. "Rosa told me. She was concerned. I called the principal." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You called my daughter's school?" "I made a donation for diversity training. I asked for an apology to Zoe. I made it clear that what happened was unacceptable." Eleanor forced herself to meet his eyes. "I know I should have asked first. I know this was your situation to handle, but I couldn't just do nothing when I had the power to help." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but Eleanor heard emotion underneath. "Ms. Hayes, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Zoe is my daughter. My responsibility. I don't need you fighting my battles or protecting my child. I'm not trying to take over. I'm just using the privilege I have to address an injustice. That's not about you or your ability to protect Zoe. It's about the fact that a racist teacher humiliated a 10-year-old, and I have the resources to ensure it doesn't happen again. And what happens next time, when I can't call Eleanor Hayes to fix things with her money and her connections? When Zoe faces discrimination, and I'm just her janitor father who can't afford to fight back?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, control slipping. "You think you're helping, but you're teaching my daughter that problems get solved by rich white women making phone calls. That's not the world she lives in." The words landed like slaps, and Eleanor felt shame burn through her anger. She had not considered this perspective. had acted from privilege without understanding how her actions might undermine Marcus's agency, might teach Zoe lessons about power and dependency that Marcus had spent 10 years trying to avoid. "You're right. I'm sorry. I overstepped." Eleanor's voice came out smaller than intended. "I wanted to help, but I didn't think about what that help might cost you." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I know your intentions were good. And honestly, I'm glad the principal is scared enough of you to actually do something. But next time, ask first. Let me decide whether I want your help. Don't just assume you know what's best for my daughter." "Okay, I will, I promise." They stood in uncomfortable silence, the foyer suddenly feeling too large and too empty. Finally, Marcus shifted his weight. "I need to start my shift." "Of course, I'll let you work." But as Marcus moved toward his equipment, he paused. "Ms. Hayes, thank you for caring about Zoe. Even if you went about it wrong, the caring part, that matters." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and watched Marcus disappear into the house. Rosa appeared from the hallway where she had apparently been eavesdropping. "That could have gone worse. Could have gone better, too." Eleanor sank onto the stairs, exhaustion overwhelming her. "I don't know how to do this. How to help without hurting. How to use privilege without being patronizing. How to care about people without making it about me." Rosa sat beside her, a shocking breach of employer-employee boundaries that somehow felt entirely appropriate. "You learn by making mistakes, by listening when people tell you that you've messed up, by trying again even when it's hard." She paused. "You know what the difference is between you now and you 3 years ago?" "What?" 3 years ago, you would have watched Marcus's reaction on camera and analyzed it. You would have documented his anger in your files. You would have seen it as data instead of feeling it as relationship. Rosa's voice was gentle. Today you stood in front of him. You apologized when you were wrong. You're learning, Ms. Hayes, slowly, messily, but learning. Eleanor wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the pain of change was evidence of growth rather than just pain. But doubt lingered, insidious and familiar, whispering that she was failing at being a person the same way she had failed at surveillance, just in different ways. What if I can't learn fast enough? What if I hurt people while I'm trying to figure this out? Then you hurt people, and you apologize, and you try to do better next time. Rosa stood, brushing invisible dust from her uniform. "Perfection isn't the goal, Ms. Hayes. Being human is." Eleanor watched Rosa walk away, this woman who had endured 18 years of surveillance and still offered wisdom and patience and grace. The magnitude of that generosity settled over Eleanor like weight, like responsibility, like a gift she had not earned but would spend the rest of her life trying to deserve. She sat on the stairs until the foyer grew dark, thinking about Marcus and Zoe and the ways privilege could harm even when trying to help. Thinking about Catherine and Sarah Williams and the threads that connected strangers through acts of care. Thinking about cameras and cages and the specific terror of being seen without the mediating lens of surveillance. Somewhere in the house, Marcus was cleaning. Eleanor did not know which room, did not check monitors, just trusted that he was there, doing his work, carrying his grief and his anger and his fierce love for his daughter. Just trusted that the house would not collapse simply because she did not know everything happening within its walls. The not knowing was still terrifying. But Eleanor was learning to sit with terror, to let it exist without letting it control her. Small progress, incremental change, but change nonetheless, and that had to be enough for tonight. The invitation arrived. 3 weeks after Eleanor's botched intervention with Zoe's school, delivered by Rosa with the careful neutrality that had become her default expression when navigating Eleanor's ongoing transformation. Heavy cardstock, cream-colored, embossed with the Catherine Hayes Memorial Foundation logo. The annual gala, scheduled for mid-December at the Hartford Hilton Ballroom. 200 guests expected, healthcare workers, donors, advocates. The event Eleanor had managed from a distance for 3 years, writing checks and approving budgets but never actually attending because crowds meant variables she could not control. Eleanor stared at the invitation, her name printed in elegant script below the foundation seal. Guest of honor. Keynote speaker. The words felt like accusations. "You don't have to go," Rosa offered, though her tone suggested she thought otherwise. "You could send a representative, participate remotely like you've done before, and miss the opportunity to do the one thing my mother actually wanted me to do with her foundation, to honor the people who do the work Catherine believed mattered most." Eleanor set the invitation on her desk. "No, I'll go. I'll probably have 17 panic attacks before the event and 3 during, but I'll go." Rosa's expression softened. "Your mother would be proud, not of the foundation, of you trying." The words settled in Eleanor's chest, equal parts comfort and ache. She had spent 3 years building the foundation as a monument to Catherine, while simultaneously becoming someone her mother would not have recognized. Someone who watched instead of engaged, who controlled instead of trusted, who let fear calcify into isolation. "There's something else," Rosa continued. "The foundation board voted to give the annual Compassionate Care Award to Sarah Williams. Again. She won it the first year, but they want to create a named award in Catherine's honor, and Sarah agreed to accept it and speak about her work." Eleanor's throat tightened. Sarah Williams. The nurse who had held Catherine's hand, the nurse who had held Emma's hand, the invisible thread connecting Eleanor and Marcus through shared loss and shared gratitude. Eleanor had not spoken to Sarah since her mother's funeral 3 years ago, had let the relationship dissolve into formal foundation business conducted through intermediaries. "Does Marcus know?" "Not yet. The board made the decision yesterday. I thought you should tell him. Give him the option to attend or not attend without pressure." Rosa paused. "Also thought you might want to, I don't know, actually meet the woman who inspired your employee to talk to portraits in the middle of the night." Eleanor appreciated Rosa's gentle sarcasm, the way she had begun to treat Eleanor more like a human and less like a surveillance threat in the weeks since the cameras came down. Their relationship was evolving into something that resembled actual friendship, though Eleanor was still learning how friendship worked when it was not mediated by Mel's power and observation. "I'll tell him tonight." Marcus arrived for his shift at 11, and Eleanor was waiting again, this time with 2 cups of coffee and a nervousness that felt absurd given she was simply offering an invitation. But nothing about her interactions with Marcus felt simple anymore. Each conversation carried weight, felt like a test she might fail, another opportunity to overstep or assume or damage the fragile trust they were building. "Ms. Hayes." Marcus accepted the coffee with visible surprise. "This is new." "I'm trying to develop social skills. Patricia says offering beverages is a good start." Eleanor attempted a smile. "I have something to tell you. The foundation is giving its annual award to Sarah Williams next month. At the gala, I thought you might want to know." Marcus's hand tightened on the coffee cup. His face went through several expressions too quickly for Eleanor to track, finally settling on something between hope and fear. "Sarah's coming here? To Connecticut?" "To Hartford, for the gala." Eleanor kept her voice carefully neutral. "You're invited, of course, you and Zoe both. The foundation will cover formal wear, transportation, everything. No obligation, no pressure, just an invitation if you want to see Sarah again." Marcus was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to worry she had made another mistake, had pushed when she should have waited, had assumed when she should have asked. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried emotion he was not quite managing to suppress. "I looked for her after Emma died. Called the hospital, left messages. She'd already transferred. I wanted to thank her, to tell her what her kindness meant. But I never found her." He looked at Eleanor. "You're saying I could see her again? Could introduce Zoe to the woman who held Emma's hand?" "Yes, if you want to." Why are you doing this? The school donation, now this. Why do you keep? Marcus struggled for words. Why do you keep trying to fix things for me? Eleanor had anticipated this question, had rehearsed answers that sounded reasonable and appropriate. But standing in front of Marcus, seeing the genuine confusion in his face, all her preparation dissolved into simple truth. Because I spent 2 months watching you through cameras, learning everything about your life except what actually mattered. Because you showed me what surveillance costs. Because I want to do something right, something that helps instead of hurts, and this feels like maybe it could be that. She paused. But Rosa was correct when she said I shouldn't make you my redemption project. So if this feels like that, tell me, and I'll stop. Marcus studied her, and Eleanor forced herself to endure the scrutiny without deflecting, without hiding behind careful words or strategic distance. This was what relationship required. Being seen without surveillance, being known without control, being vulnerable to another person's judgment. It doesn't feel like redemption, Marcus finally offered. It feels like you're trying to build something different from what you had before. Something that includes other people instead of just watching them. He sipped his coffee. Okay. Yes. Zoe and I will come to the gala. We'll meet Sarah, thank you. Relief flooded through Eleanor, disproportionate to the situation, but genuine nonetheless. I'll have my assistant send details. Formal wear, transportation, all of it. And Marcus? If at any point this feels wrong or uncomfortable or too much, you can change your mind. No judgment, no consequences. I know, that's why I'm saying yes. He moved toward his cleaning equipment, then paused. Ms. Hayes, one more thing. You should stop waiting in the foyer for me every night. It's making Rosa think you have a crush on me, and I'm pretty sure that's not what's happening here. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face. Rosa said that? Rosa says a lot of things. Most of them are observations you probably don't want to hear but should. Marcus smiled slightly. But she's wrong about the crush thing. You're just lonely and I'm convenient. That's okay. Just maybe branch out. Make some actual friends who aren't your employees. Then he was gone, and Eleanor stood holding her coffee, simultaneously embarrassed and grateful for Marcus's bluntness. He was correct, of course. She had been using him as a proxy for social connection, had been treating their interactions as friendship when they were actually employee and employer navigating complicated territory made more complicated by Eleanor's surveillance history. She needed friends, real ones, people who were not paid to be in her presence, who could tell her hard truths without fear of termination, who could witness her ongoing disaster of personal growth without professional obligation. The realization was both obvious and devastating. Eleanor Hayes, 44 years old, tech billionaire, founder of a major charitable foundation, had no friends, had systematically isolated herself for 3 years, and before that had maintained only surface relationships, professional connections that never went deeper than shared interests or mutual benefit. Patricia would be thrilled by this revelation, would probably frame it as a breakthrough. But standing alone in her foyer, Eleanor just felt the accumulated weight of choices made and time lost and connections never formed. She pulled out her phone and called Patricia, because calling her therapist at midnight was at least better than waiting for Marcus in the foyer every night. I need to make friends, Eleanor announced when Patricia answered. Real ones, not employees, not people I pay, actual friends who choose to know me. Patricia's laugh was warm. Hello to you too, Eleanor. And yes, you do need friends. What prompted this revelation? Marcus told me I'm lonely and using him as convenient social connection. Also that Rosa thinks I have a crush on him, which is mortifying because Rosa is never wrong about anything. Do you have a crush on Marcus? No. I have desperation for human connection manifesting as inappropriate attachment to my janitor, who happens to be the only person other than you and Rosa who I've had honest conversation with in 3 years. Eleanor sank onto the stairs. How do adults make friends? I can't remember. I had college friends, work friends, but those all dissolved when I inherited money and stopped needing employment. Everyone else I know is either on my foundation board or wants donations or is related to business interests. I don't know how to just meet people who might like me for reasons that aren't financial. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor could picture her in the home office, notepad balanced on knee, deciding how to navigate this particular crisis. Eleanor, this is good. Hard, but good. You're recognizing isolation and wanting to change it. That's huge progress. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like being 44 and not knowing how to make friends like a normal person. Normal is overrated. Focus on authentic. Patricia's voice carried the gentle firmness Eleanor had learned meant she was about to receive difficult advice. Start with the gala. You're going, which is already brave. While you're there, talk to people. Not about foundation business. About actual things. Ask questions. Listen to answers. See if anyone interesting emerges. I'll have panic attacks, multiple ones, probably in front of important donors. Probably. Bring medication. Bring coping strategies. Bring Rosa if she's willing. Patricia paused. And Eleanor? Cut yourself some slack. You're relearning how to be human after 3 years of intentional isolation. That's hard work. The fact that you're doing it at all is remarkable. Eleanor wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that her awkward stumbling toward connection was progress rather than just new ways to fail. But doubt was persistent, familiar, easier to trust than hope. They talked for another 20 minutes, Patricia walking Eleanor through anxiety management strategies and social scripts for the gala, building a framework that might prevent complete disaster. When they hung up, Eleanor felt marginally less terrified, though terror still claimed the majority of her emotional real estate. She walked to the East Wing corridor and stood before Catherine's portrait, a habit she had developed in the weeks since dismantling surveillance. Coming here felt different now that she knew Marcus visited the same space, now that she understood they were both seeking something from a painted face that could offer nothing but the memory of who Catherine had been. I'm going to the gala, Mom. I'm going to actually show up instead of hiding behind donations and distance. I'm terrified, and I'll probably embarrass myself, but I'm going. Eleanor touched the frame. Marcus will be there, Zoe too. They're going to meet Sarah, which feels important in ways I don't fully understand. Like something you started is completing itself without you here to see it. The portrait offered no response, but Eleanor had stopped expecting answers from the dead. They were gone, and the living had to figure out how to continue without them. Had to honor their memory through action rather than surveillance, through connection rather than control. Eleanor returned to her bedroom and forced herself to sleep. Though sleep was fitful and interrupted by dreams of cameras and crowds and standing alone in a ballroom while 200 people watched her fall apart. The weeks leading to the gala passed in a blur of preparation and panic. Eleanor hired a personal stylist because her wardrobe consisted primarily of clothes suitable for never leaving her house. She practiced breathing exercises until they became automatic. She reviewed the guest list obsessively, researching attendees so she would have conversation topics, then forced herself to stop because research was just surveillance by another name. Rosa helped with patient efficiency, offering advice about the event without pushing, reminding Eleanor to eat and sleep and take breaks from the anxiety spiral that threatened to consume her. Their relationship had shifted into something resembling genuine care, and Eleanor found herself grateful for Rosa's presence in ways that had nothing to do with cleaning or household management. Marcus continued his night shifts, and Eleanor mostly succeeded in not waiting for him in the foyer, though she found other excuses to cross paths, to check that he was okay, that the school situation had resolved, that Zoe was excited about the gala. Each interaction was brief and professional, but underneath the surface, Eleanor felt the foundation of something being built. Not friendship exactly. Not yet, but trust. Mutual recognition. The possibility of connection that did not require cameras or control. 2 days before the gala, Eleanor's assistant called with a complication. The keynote speaker, a prominent healthcare advocate, had canceled due to family emergency. The board wanted Eleanor to speak instead, to stand before 200 people and talk about Catherine, about compassionate care, about why the foundation mattered. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to find someone else, to hide behind her usual methods of participation that did not require physical presence or emotional vulnerability. But she thought about Marcus and surveillance and the ways she had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of risk. She called the board president and accepted. Spent the next 48 hours writing and rewriting remarks, practicing in front of mirrors, having multiple panic attacks that left her shaking and exhausted, but determined to follow through. The night of the gala arrived with the crystalline cold that defines December in Connecticut. Eleanor's driver picked up Marcus and Zoe first, and when Eleanor entered the limousine, she found Zoe pressed against the window in a navy dress that made her gap-toothed smile even more radiant, and Marcus in a suit that transformed him from janitor to someone Eleanor might not have recognized if she passed him on the street. "Ms. Hayes!" Zoe bounced in her seat. "Dad says you have a big house with paintings and gardens. Can I visit sometime?" Eleanor caught Marcus's apologetic look before answering. "Of course you can. Anytime your father says is okay." "Zoe, remember what we talked about. Ms. Hayes is very busy. We don't invite ourselves places." Marcus's voice carried gentle correction without diminishing his daughter's enthusiasm. "It's not an invitation if I'm offering," Eleanor countered. "Zoe, you're welcome at the estate whenever you want to visit. Your father knows this." The drive to Hartford passed with Zoe's running commentary about school, about her science project, about her friend Maya, whose father was also a single parent, and worked nights too. Eleanor listened fascinated by the easy way Zoe moved through the world, by her lack of self-consciousness or fear, 10 years old and already more socially competent than Eleanor had been at 44. Marcus watched his daughter with an expression Eleanor recognized from surveillance footage, though seeing it in person felt different, deeper. He loved Zoe with a fierceness that required no documentation, that existed in every glance and gentle correction and patient answer to her endless questions. The ballroom at the Hartford Hilton had been transformed into something elegant and warm. Round tables draped in cream linens, centerpieces of winter flowers, soft lighting that made the space feel intimate despite its size. 200 people mingled, their conversations creating a low hum that made Eleanor's chest tighten with anxiety. She stood at the entrance, frozen, while Marcus and Zoe moved past her into the room. Rosa appeared at her elbow, wearing a dress Eleanor had never seen, her usual uniform replaced by something that suggested she was a guest rather than staff. "You invited Rosa?" Eleanor managed to ask Marcus. "Foundation board invited me," Rosa corrected. 18 years of watching you from the inside apparently qualifies as perspective they value. But I'm here for you, not them. Someone needs to make sure you actually breathe." Eleanor wanted to protest that she did not need a handler, that she could manage a social event like a functional adult. But the protest died in her throat because it would have been a lie, and she was trying to stop lying to herself about her own limitations. "Thank you." They entered together, and immediately Eleanor was surrounded by board members and donors and healthcare workers, all wanting to express sympathy about Catherine, gratitude for the foundation, admiration for Eleanor's vision. The attention was overwhelming and exhausting, and Eleanor felt herself slipping into the careful persona she had perfected in her tech career, the version of herself that could navigate social situations through strategic charm and calculated responses. But that persona felt wrong now, felt like another form of surveillance, another way of controlling how others perceived her without actually connecting. Eleanor forced herself to drop the mask, to answer questions honestly even when honesty was awkward, to admit when she did not know things instead of bluffing competence. The shift was uncomfortable but freeing. People responded with surprise, then genuine warmth. Conversations became actual exchanges rather than performances. Eleanor found herself laughing at something a nurse said about hospital bureaucracy, found herself asking real questions about people's work and actually caring about their answers. Marcus and Zoe were across the room, and Eleanor watched as a woman approached them. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, Eleanor recognized Sarah Williams, shorter than Eleanor remembered, graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a modest dress that suggested she had not dressed for wealth or attention. The moment Sarah recognized Marcus, her face transformed. She moved forward, and Marcus met her halfway, and then they were embracing while Zoe watched with wide eyes. Eleanor could not hear their conversation from across the ballroom, but she saw Marcus crying, saw Sarah's hand on his face, saw Zoe being pulled into the embrace. Rosa appeared beside Eleanor again. "That's what your foundation made possible. Not the money, the connection, the bringing together of people who needed to find each other." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the emotion blocking her throat. This was what Catherine had wanted. Not monuments or plaques or buildings with her name, just humans being good to each other, just kindness rippling forward, just the understanding that care given freely could change everything. The program began, and Eleanor found herself seated at the head table between Rosa and a doctor who had used foundation funding to establish a patient advocacy program. The dinner was elegant, the speeches were moving, and Eleanor managed to eat small amounts while her anxiety built toward the moment when she would have to stand and speak. When the Foundation Board president introduced her, Eleanor's hands trembled so badly she had to grip the podium to steady herself. 200 faces looked up at her with expectation, with interest, with the assumption that she had something valuable to say. She abandoned her prepared remarks. The words she had practiced felt hollow now, felt like the surveillance version of herself trying to control narrative and perception. Instead, Eleanor spoke truth. 3 years ago, my mother, Catherine Hayes, died because someone noticed something wrong and did not speak up, because hierarchy mattered more than a patient, because silence felt safer than advocacy. Her voice shook, but held. I responded to that loss by building walls, literally and figuratively. I installed surveillance in my home. I watched people instead of talking to them. I tried to prevent loss through control, through knowing everything, through eliminating every possible blind spot. The room was utterly silent. Eleanor saw board members exchanging glances, saw Rosa's encouraging nod, saw Marcus watching with an expression she could not quite read. It didn't work. Surveillance didn't make me safe. It made me alone. It took me 3 years and some very patient people to understand that you cannot watch your way to safety. You can only live your way there. Eleanor paused, steadying herself. My mother believed in compassionate care. She believed in nurses like Sarah Williams who stay beyond their shifts and hold patients' hands and make dying less terrifying. She believed that the antidote to loss was not control, but connection. Not surveillance, but trust. Her eyes found Sarah in the crowd. Tonight we honor Sarah Williams, who held my mother's hand and made her death bearable, who held Emma Webb's hand and did the same, who represents everything this foundation exists to support. Not just competent care, but compassionate presence. Not just medical expertise, but human connection. Eleanor's voice cracked. I've learned in the past few months that being human is harder than being watchful, that trust requires more courage than surveillance, that the only way to honor the people we've lost is to live fully in ways they taught us, even when living fully feels terrifying. She looked at Marcus and Zoe. This foundation will continue supporting nurses and advocates and anyone who chooses connection over convenience, who stays with people in their darkness, who understands that some things matter more than procedure or profit or self-protection. Eleanor stepped back from the podium. The applause was sustained and genuine, and she felt Rosa's hand on her shoulder, felt the room responding not to her wealth or her foundation, but to her vulnerability, to the admission that she was broken and trying to heal. Sarah Williams approached the stage to accept her award, and Eleanor descended to stand with the audience. Sarah spoke about Catherine, about Emma, about the privilege of witnessing people in their most vulnerable moments. She spoke about the nurses who had taught her, about the patients who had shaped her understanding of care, about the fact that compassion was a choice made repeatedly, not a trait some people possessed and others lacked. Eleanor Hayes asked me once, right after her mother died, why I stayed in the room, why I didn't just do my job and leave. And I told her what my mentor told me. You don't leave people alone in the dark if you can stay. Sarah's voice carried clear and strong across the ballroom. That's all compassionate care is. Just staying. Just being present even when presence is painful. Just choosing connection over convenience again and again until it becomes not a choice but a reflex. The words settled over Eleanor like a benediction. You don't leave people alone in the dark if you can stay. Catherine had stayed with Eleanor for 41 years before cancer took her. Sarah had stayed with Catherine and Emma. Marcus stayed with Zoe despite exhaustion and poverty and grief. Rosa stayed with Eleanor despite 18 years of surveillance. Staying was the opposite of surveillance. Staying required trust that the other person would not harm you, that vulnerability would not be exploited, that being seen would not result in being destroyed. Eleanor had spent 3 years running from exactly that risk, and it had cost her everything except the money that never protected her from loss in the first place. After the ceremony, people mingled again, and Eleanor found herself in conversation with a pediatric nurse who worked with terminally ill children. The woman spoke about helping families say goodbye, about making death less frightening for 8-year-olds, about the specific devastation of watching parents bury their children. Eleanor listened without performing, without trying to manage the interaction, just present with another person's pain and wisdom and hard-won understanding. The nurse eventually moved away, and Eleanor stood alone for a moment, catching her breath. Rosa appeared with water Eleanor had not realized she needed. You did good, really good. I had a panic attack during the speech. Could you tell? Everyone has panic attacks during speeches. You just powered through it. Rosa's expression was warm. Your mother would have been proud, not of the speech, of you being brave enough to be honest. Before Eleanor could respond, Marcus and Zoe approached with Sarah between them. Zoe was chattering about butterflies, apparently having found a shared interest with Sarah, and Marcus looked lighter than Eleanor had seen him since the night shift began. Sarah addressed Eleanor directly, her voice carrying the same gentleness Eleanor remembered from the hospital. Eleanor, thank you for creating this, for honoring your mother by supporting people like me, and for bringing Marcus and Zoe here tonight. I've thought about Emma's family for years, wondered if they were okay, if Zoe remembered anything about her mother. She doesn't, Marcus offered quietly. She was too young, but I tell her stories, and tonight she got to meet someone who knew Emma, who can tell her things I can't, who can make Emma real in ways memory can't quite manage. Zoe tugged on Eleanor's sleeve. Ms. Hayes, Sarah says you have rose gardens. My mommy liked roses. Can I see them sometime? Eleanor's heart clenched. She knelt to meet Zoe's eyes. Your mother had excellent taste. Catherine loved roses too. You can visit the gardens whenever you want. They're most beautiful in June, but even in winter they're special. Can we go tomorrow? Zoe looked at Marcus. Please, Dad. I want to see where Ms. Eleanor's mom walked. Marcus hesitated, clearly weighing logistics and boundaries and the complexities of his daughter becoming attached to Eleanor's world. But before he could answer, Sarah spoke. I'm staying in Connecticut through the weekend. If you're all going to the gardens, I'd love to join. See where Catherine spent her time. Complete the circle, so to speak. Eleanor found herself nodding before fully processing the implications. Yes, tomorrow, all of you. I'll have lunch prepared. We'll walk the gardens and… She paused, uncertain how to finish the sentence, uncertain what came next in this strange evolution of relationships that had begun with surveillance and somehow arrived at genuine invitation. We'll just be together, Rosa finished for her. That's enough. The gala wound down, people drifting away in clusters, the ballroom slowly emptying. Eleanor stood with Marcus and Zoe and Sarah and Rosa, this unlikely assemblage of people connected through loss and care and the invisible threads that tied strangers together across time and grief. As they left the hotel, stepping into December cold that burned in Eleanor's lungs, Zoe slipped her small hand into Eleanor's. The contact was startling, unfamiliar, the physical connection something Eleanor had not experienced since Catherine's death. She looked down at this child who had no reason to trust her, who had been humiliated at school and whose father worked nights cleaning floors and saw nothing but openness. "Thank you for tonight," Zoe whispered. "Dad's been sad for a really long time, but tonight he looked happy." Eleanor's throat closed. She squeezed Zoe's hand gently. "Your dad is a good man, the best I've met in a very long time." "I know. That's why I picked him." Zoe grinned, gap-toothed and radiant, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Some wall she had not known still existed. The drive back to Greenwich was quiet, Zoe dozing against Marcus's shoulder, Sarah and Rosa in soft conversation about healthcare policy. Eleanor sat watching the highway lights blur past, thinking about surveillance and trust and the ways humans learned to be brave when bravery felt impossible. Tomorrow they would walk the gardens. Tomorrow Sarah would see where Catherine had spent her final healthy months. Tomorrow Zoe would run through spaces that had been empty for 3 years, filling them with life Eleanor had forgotten was possible. Tomorrow was terrifying, but tonight had been survivable. And if Eleanor could survive tonight, perhaps she could survive tomorrow. Perhaps she could learn to live without cameras, without control, without the desperate need to know everything before it happened. Perhaps she could learn to just stay present in the darkness, trusting that other people would stay too. That connection was stronger than surveillance, that Catherine's legacy was not in marble halls or endowed foundations, but in the simple, radical choice to not leave people alone when you could stay. The limousine pulled up to Eleanor's estate, and she walked Marcus and Zoe to their car. Rosa already inside unpacking what would no doubt be a pointed commentary about Eleanor's social performance. Sarah had gotten a separate car back to her hotel, but promised to arrive by noon the next day. Marcus paused before getting in his vehicle. Zoe already buckled and half asleep. "Ms. Hayes, what you said in the speech about surveillance versus living, that took courage. It took desperation, but I'll accept that courage and desperation sometimes look identical." Eleanor wrapped her coat tighter against the cold. "Thank you for coming, for bringing Zoe, for giving me a chance to do something right." "You're doing more right than you realize." Marcus's voice was gentle. "See you tomorrow, for garden walking and whatever else comes next." Eleanor watched them drive away, then turned to her mansion with its reduced camera system and its empty rooms and its potential for something different from what it had been. Rosa was already inside making tea, already preparing to debrief the evening with the brutal honesty that Eleanor had learned to value. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fail or connect, or both simultaneously. But tonight had been survived. Tonight Eleanor had stood before 200 people and admitted her brokenness without asking for absolution. Tonight she had witnessed Marcus reunite with Sarah, had felt Zoe's hand in hers, had heard Rosa's pride, had taken one more step toward becoming someone her mother might have recognized. The gardens would be cold tomorrow, the roses dormant until spring, but Zoe would run through them anyway, would bring life to spaces that had been carefully maintained but never truly inhabited since Catherine's death. And Eleanor would walk beside her, learning from a 10-year-old what her 47 cameras had never taught her. That presence was its own form of protection, that vulnerability was strength, that privacy mattered precisely because it created space for authentic connection rather than performing for constant observation. Eleanor entered her home and did not check the security monitors, did not verify that the perimeter was secure, that everything was in its place. She simply walked to her room, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat at the window looking out at gardens she would share tomorrow with people who were not employees or board members or professional relationships, but something closer to what she had forgotten was possible, something closer to family, chosen and complicated and earned through slow trust rather than installed through technology or purchased with donations, the kind that stayed when staying was hard, that witnessed without recording, that offered presence instead of surveillance. Eleanor slept better that night than she had in 3 years, and when she woke at 3:15 a.m., she did not check her watch to mark the time of Catherine's death. Instead, she thought about tomorrow, about Zoe's laughter and Sarah's wisdom and Marcus's patient presence and Rosa's grounding care. She thought about gardens in winter and how even dormant things held the promise of spring, how death was not an ending but a transformation, how love persisted beyond loss, how humans could choose connection even after connection had destroyed them, how Catherine's portrait would witness tomorrow's gathering not through Eleanor's cameras, but through the presence of people who carried her memory forward through the simple, radical act of staying with each other, of not leaving anyone alone in the dark when they could offer light.